much for that great speech, Jeff. Keep us on schedule. I'm going to keep this introduction short. There's also a man that needs no introduction, constitutional lawyer, professor, George Washington University, commentator, great mind, champion of free speech, Professor Jonathan Turley.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here and to be in the presence of one of the greatest men of our generation, Ron Paul. I actually wish I could stay for lunch, but I actually cut a deal in a pure market exchange with my teenage daughter that I drove her to a Pitbull concert 2 days ago. In exchange, we got a father-daughter lunch scheduled. So I think she's now has reached a conclusion that that was not a good deal, but it's one in which I fully intend to enforce. I just want to talk to you briefly, and as Henry VIII told Anne Boleyn, I will not keep you long. But I want to talk a bit about my favorite subject, which is free speech. And the erosion of free speech, not just in the West, but in the United States specifically. We are living through what I think can fairly be called the most anti-free speech period in our history. And it is a movement that I never thought could possibly gain as much traction as it has. Indeed, I'm worried about our ability to make it through this period because of recent polls and changes of attitude. Free speech used to be the thing that defined us. It was a thing that our country was created to protect. Now it's more often referred to as the threat to our very existence, the harm that has to be controlled. Now, I'm a dinosaur. I'm a classic liberal in terms of free speech. I think the solution to bad speech is better speech. I don't know many limitations on speech that I've ever endorsed. But that is becoming a minority position. The name of these remarks is after a piece I have coming out in one of the Harvard Law Journals entitled Harm and Hegemony. And what it is meant to do is to discuss the loss of free speech in the United States, and not just on the internet, but also on our campuses and in our everyday lives. Throughout its history, the United States has struggled through anti-speech movements. There's been a certain pendulum swing, but we have tended to swing back. We have tended to correct as we've moved too far against free speech. At the very outset, we had a free speech movement that was quickly snuffed out by John Adams, who pushed forward the Alien and Sedition Act to actually kill those that he disagreed with. But what concerns me the most as someone who considers himself a Millian academic, that is someone who writes John Stuart Mill, is how the harm principle of John Stuart Mill is being used by many of my colleagues to defend the crackdown on free speech. It's an entire abuse of Mill's writings. Mill made it clear that harm, under his famous harm principle, was not supposed to include what he considered moral harms or affronts that people have. You harming me because of who you are, what you say, what you represent. That debate occurred when Mill was alive. People like Devlin famously argued that speech had to be curtailed because speech harmed people. Mill was the voice against that. But now, in university after university, you see academics espousing this view. Now in Congress, you hear members of Congress arguing that speech has to be curtailed for our own benefit. For the first time, liberals, writers, editors are embracing censorship as a value. we saw recently that Representative Anna Eschew and a colleague wrote to the cable companies asking why Fox News should be allowed to continue to be on cable, the most popular cable news channel. She was asking why people should be allowed to see it. She wrote to these cable companies and said, not all news sources are the same. Some purported news outlets have been misinformation rumor mills and conspiracy theory hotbeds that produce content that leads them to real harm. Misinformation on TV has led to our current polluted information environment that radicalizes individuals to commit seditious acts and rejects public health best practices. I think she's talking about you. Now, in this den of sedition, I just want to note, you note the language that she uses, that speech itself is the harm. Speech is now a form of pollution that has to be abated, curtailed, feared. This has been repeated mantra-like by members of Congress who have called on the internet companies to engage in censorship, but also academics. Randall Bezinson argued that Supreme Court cases led to a countervailing danger of, quote, too much free speech. There's something so counterintuitive to that statement, it causes you to swoon. It's like too much liberty, too much oxygen. It's like a goldfish telling its friends, I think we have a bit too much water. Professor Marianne Franks put it this way, and you can sort of capture in her remarks what's happening on campuses. She said, the true threat to free speech on college campuses is posed not by university norms on free speech, but by the attack on those norms, by the internet culture of free speech. The internet model of free speech is little more than a cacophony where the loudest, most provocative, most unlikable voice dominates. If we want to protect free speech, we should not only resist the attempt to remake college campuses in the image of the internet, but to consider the benefits of remaking the internet in the image of the university. So what's fascinating about that is that she talks about this internet culture of free speech. Many years ago, I did an academic piece where I said that the internet is the single greatest invention of free speech since the printing press. It was the realization of what many free speech advocates have dreamt of, an open, robust forum where values, statements would rise or fall depending upon those who support them, their ability to be defended. It challenged governments. There was no accident that the first critics to the internet came from countries like China, Russia, Iran. It's a nightmare for government. And so the effort to control the internet was really an effort to control free speech. It's precisely what Mill wrote about. Mill defined free speech as essential to liberty, saying being almost as much importance to liberty of thought itself. That's why the harm principle offers us not just a measure of the danger we face, but also possibly the way to remedy it. Now, Mill himself said all restraint, qua restraint, is evil. That's the reason I like him so much. He never met a government limitation that he felt comfortable with, even though he understood that some are needed. But what you had with Mill during these early periods was this great debate with Lord Patrick Devlin, where he immediately recognized Mill for what he was, this hardened advocate of individual rights, of free speech. And Devlin immediately called him to task and said, you are going to allow people to espouse immoral thoughts, dangerous thoughts. And Mill basically said, yes. And then you can espouse your thoughts. What's interesting and what is ironic is that the left today has embraced the Devlin argument, which was an argument for imposing moral codes on society. So the great irony here is that Devlin has become the model of the left in order to silence those they disagree with. People like Catherine McKinnon have argued for banning pornography based on the very same arguments that Devlin used, that speech is harmful. As these speech codes replicate themselves across the country, we have seen greater and greater bias in their enforcement, none more evident than on university campuses. Now, I must tell you, I'm a free speech advocate that has been described as a free speech extremist, something that I take as a point of pride. I've defended academics who said that Republicans should be killed, that celebrate the death of conservatives, that call for the killing of Trump supporters. I've defended them for their right to say those things on social media. But by the way, very few people are trying to get them off social media. And very few of them are subject to any administrative measures at universities. But conservative and contrarian and libertarian professors and students are routinely investigated, suspended, and sanctioned. We had a professor at the University of California who actually physically assaulted young people at a pro-life display. She led her class outside, physically assaulted a pro-life display and its advocates. She was charged and she pled guilty to a crime. You know, I've been teaching a long time. I can't quite remember the original deal, but I sort of recall saying you can't actually beat the kinder. She's still teaching, and actually faculty supported her and called the students and these young people virtual terrorists who prompted the attack. In North Carolina, we had a professor of sociology and criminology who was a lightning rod for controversy. I don't agree with things that he wrote. I thought that he was a bit reckless in what he wrote, but I defended it because he has a right to be reckless. And then we have a right to call him out if he's reckless or if he's grotesque or whatever he's saying. But he was conservative, and he kept on getting hit by university investigations. He had to go to court to keep his job. And then finally, he made some joke about comparing the governor to running a slave ship in North Carolina. Said it was a slave state. And so a new movement came up for him to be terminated. This one succeeded. They forced him out, forced him to sign an agreement to leave teaching. His name was Mike Adams. And a couple of days before he would no longer be a teacher, Adams killed himself. But the Adams case sort of shows the point of a lot of these measures at universities. If you speak against these speech codes, you're ostracized. You're isolated. They deny you everything that matters to an intellectual. You're no longer invited to conferences. You no longer publish. For an academic, it is like having oxygen cut off. You can't be actively intellectual. And I think with Adams, he realized as his time as a professor was coming to an end, that he didn't really exist as a non-intellectual. They had rendered him someone who could not teach. But writers have joined this movement. They have supported the modern version of book burning, banning books from publishers, creation of blacklists of people who cannot be published. The Columbia Journalism Law Dean, Steve Cole, denounced the weaponization of free speech and called for censorship. He's the head of the journalism school. Harvard professors in The Atlantic said, this is a direct quote, China is right about censorship on the internet. But the biggest problem is that this is finally taking hold. We have a rising generation of censors. A new poll shows that roughly half the public supports not just corporate censorship, but government censorship. Did you ever think there would come a day that half of America would embrace censorship? The most dangerous aspect of this is that this censorship is hitting us in a blind spot. The First Amendment is a formidable protection for free speech, but it's directed only towards the government. The framers just didn't see a threat coming from private sources. And the opponents of free speech have built a movement around that. They are seeking to use private forms of censorship, and they are proving to be far more dangerous than the framers ever thought the government could become. Indeed, the very concept of a state media is a rather dated concept. We see today that there is no government propaganda ministry in the United States. You don't need one. There is a common narrative that takes hold, that is repeated, is replicated. You saw that in so many different examples on the internet, including, banning the story of Hunter Biden's laptop until after the election. It was clearly a true story. He wasn't even denying it was his laptop. No one sued for defamation, but it was killed. And then when the Twitter CEO came to Congress and apologized after the election, said, "My bad." The response from the Democratic senators was truly chilling. Senator Coons said, "You better not go back on censorship," and said, "I actually want to make sure that you will include these subjects," including things like climate change. Senator Richard Blumenthal told them that he wouldn't tolerate, quote, "backsliding or retrenching on censorship," and called for, quote, "robust content modification." That's the new Orwellian term for censorship. So we now have a sort of shadow state that is actively being used, not just in free speech, even on vaccinations, right? You'll notice that Biden first said that he was going to require a mandate of vaccinations, and then his lawyers came up to him and said, "By the way, we can't do that." And then he said, "Well, I'm calling on companies to require vaccinations." And then he kept on pressuring them, saying, we're going to demand this. The same thing is happening with the internet, demanding censorship. This is doing indirectly what the Constitution says you cannot do directly. And it creates a shadow state. It moves this to a group of people that cannot be regulated in the same way under the Constitution. So we have this movement which is dedicated more now to silencing others than to confront and debate them. That's what it started on college campuses. My article in Harvard suggests various ways in which we can deal with this using Mill's harm principle. And first and foremost, getting the harm principle right. It is not a harm to you to justify regulation because you don't like what someone said. That's not a harm for the harm principle. What you have is free speech to answer them. But the government under the harm principle has to protect you from harm. And that means protecting what Mill is often, he didn't actually use these terms, it's often attributed to Mill, but the marketplace of ideas. We need to protect the marketplace of ideas. Now, in my article, I know, look, it may sound rather oxymoronic to say we need to coerce free speech. But we do. The government needs to protect spaces for free speech to thrive. That's not dictating speech. That's protecting the right for speech to be heard. That's why we need to protect the virtual space. Use Section 230 and start to put pressure on these companies or their substitution to allow the internet to regain its role as a free speech zone. And we need to use the copious amounts of federal funding on universities to require, if you're going to receive federal funding, that you protect free speech. I don't know if it'll succeed. Groups like Antifa began on college campuses. I'm a critic of Antifa. I've been for many years. Even before they became well known, many of us saw them on campus attacking people, beating up people, threatening academics. You know, in Mark Bray's Antifa, the Anti-Fascist Handbook, he goes into great detail that this is in its base an anti-free speech movement. It is the most successful anti-free speech organization in our history. He says, quote, "At heart of the anti-fascist outlook is a rejection of the classical liberal phrase that says, I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it." Bray says, Antifa doesn't believe in that. They want you to stop saying it. And he goes on to say, most Americans in Antifa have been anarchists or anti-authoritarian communists. From that standpoint, free speech as such is merely a bourgeois fantasy unworthy of consideration. So make no mistake about Antifa. Recently we had an MSNBC host saying, you know, Antifa stands for anti-fascist, so if you're objecting, you must be a fascist. As if we can judge all things by their name. Because if it's in the name, then it must clearly be anti-fascist. In fact, Antifa is the most fascistic organization I've ever seen. It is designed there to keep people from speaking. But you had the current Attorney General of Minnesota and former head of the DNC actually waving the Antifa handbook around with approval. And it has taken hold. Even at GW, we had a George Washington student, Jason Charter, who was viewed as a ringleader of Antifa, who led the destruction of the statues in Washington, D.C. After he was arrested, he said something that really stood out. He said, the movement is winning. He's right. It is winning. And worse yet, Antifa knows it. You know, William Douglas, 70 years ago, in his book, The One Un-American Act, said that limiting free speech is the most dangerous of all subversions. It's the one un-American act that could easily defeat us all. The question is whether we have the strength and values to meet that challenge. Across Europe, free speech is in an absolute collapse. Speech is criminalized. The categories of regulated speech are expanding. It's now a crime to have speech that is insulting or viewed as intimidating, that refers to groups in a disreputable way. That tide has reached the United States. We have been the bulwark of free speech for our whole existence. So this is an existential fight. We can either stay silent, which is exactly what groups like Antifa want, or we can fight for the things that define us. Just keep in mind, everything Antifa does, everything these academics are suggesting are designed to create silence. Because in that silence, everything dies. Every value we hold. Free speech is the very lifeblood of the Constitution. None of it, freedom of religion, free press, association, mean anything unless we can speak without fear. So we have to be fearless. We have to remember what defines us. And we have to fight for free speech. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Turley. Terrific talk. Now we're going to take an hour for lunch, so sit back, visit with your neighbors, and walk around, and we'll reconvene at 1 p.m.
Sounds good. All right, how are you?